What if the Soviet Union won the space race? On July 20th, 1969, the world held its breath. But the voice that crackled across 384,000 kilometers of space was not speaking English. A Soviet cosmonaut stood on the moon beneath a red flag, while Earth hung silently above the horizon. To understand how that happened, we have to go back 12 years. On October 4th, 1957, a silver sphere the size of a beach ball rose from the Kazakh steppe. Sputnik became the world's first artificial satellite, and America did not sleep that night. Behind every Soviet space triumph stood one man the Americans didn't even know by name: Sergei Korolev, the chief designer. His identity was a state secret. He had survived Stalin's gulags, returned from imprisonment, and dedicated his life to building humanity's future among the stars. Then came April 12th, 1961. Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. America was stunned. President Kennedy responded with a bold promise. The United States would send a man to the moon. The space race accelerated. In 1965, Alexei Leonov became the first person to walk in space. The Soviet Union still led every major milestone. Yet beneath the victories, trouble was growing. The Soviet moon program was fragmented. Rival design bureaus fought for resources and influence. The massive N-1 moon rocket suffered from technical problems and organizational chaos. Only one man possessed the authority to hold everything together. On January 14th, 1966, Sergei Korolev entered a Moscow hospital for surgery. In our world, he died on the operating table. In this world, he survived. The operation succeeded. He recovered. And history changed. With Korolev alive, the N-1 program finally gained what it desperately needed: a single vision and a single leader. He consolidated competing design bureaus, eliminated bureaucratic infighting, and focused the Soviet lunar effort. Technical flaws that would have doomed the rocket were identified and corrected. By 1968, the N-1 was ready. The rocket stood 105 meters tall, with 30 engines clustered beneath its first stage. It was an engineering monster. Workers nicknamed it the Tsar Rocket. Korolev called it the key to the cosmos. Meanwhile, NASA felt confident. Apollo missions were succeeding. Apollo 8 orbited the moon at Christmas in 1968. Most Americans believed victory was already secured. They had no idea what was happening behind the fences of Baikonur. Security surrounding the Soviet lunar program remained absolute. Korolev selected Alexei Leonov to command the first lunar landing mission. Leonov trained relentlessly. The first human to walk in space would now attempt to become the first human to walk on another world. In December 1968, the N-1 launched unmanned. It cleared the tower. All 30 engines performed flawlessly. The mission succeeded. For the first time in years, Korolev allowed himself to believe the moon was within reach. By the summer of 1969, two rockets stood ready on opposite sides of the world. Apollo 11 waited in Florida. The Soviet lunar mission waited in Kazakhstan. The race had narrowed to days. On July 3rd, 1969, the N-1 thundered into the night sky. 30 engines ignited simultaneously. The Earth shook. Leonov felt the vibration through every bone in his body as the rocket climbed higher and higher. This time it did not explode. This time it flew. 3 days later, the spacecraft entered lunar orbit. Leonov transferred into the tiny LK lunar lander. Unlike Apollo, the Soviet design would place only one man on the surface. One man carrying the ambitions of an empire. On July 7th, 1969, Leonov began his descent. 1,000 meters. 500. 100. 10. The landing engine shut down. The moon had been touched. 22 minutes later, the hatch opened. Alexei Leonov descended the ladder and placed his boot into the lunar dust. He looked toward Earth. Then he spoke. "I step for all Soviet people." Humanity had reached the moon. The Soviet Union had arrived first. Across Moscow, celebrations erupted instantly. Red Square filled with hundreds of thousands of people. State television broadcast continuously through the night. The next morning, newspaper headlines stretched across entire front pages. For millions of Soviet citizens, it felt like proof that history belonged to them. In Washington, the reaction was very different. President Nixon's administration had prepared statements for victory and disaster. They had prepared nothing for defeat. Apollo 11 still sat on the launch pad. The question became unavoidable. Should America proceed with a mission that would now be second? Nixon chose to continue. Apollo 11 launched and landed successfully on July 20th. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin performed brilliantly. The science was groundbreaking, but they were 13 days late. The first footprints belonged to Leonov. The headline had already been written. Around the world, reactions crossed ideological lines. Many who opposed Soviet communism still felt a sense of awe. A human being had walked on the moon. Politics could not entirely diminish the achievement. For the first time in history, Sergei Korolev appeared publicly. The once secret chief designer addressed the Soviet people. Looking exhausted but triumphant, he delivered a simple message. "We always knew we would get there. We just needed time." The propaganda victory was enormous. Throughout Eastern Europe, crowds gathered in city squares to listen to broadcasts from the moon. Whatever doubts people held about the Soviet system, this moment felt undeniable. In the United States, arguments erupted. Some demanded an even greater response, a mission to Mars. Others believed the race was over. Eventually, a compromise emerged. America would focus on the Space Shuttle. It was reusable, it was innovative, but it remained confined to Earth orbit. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was already planning something larger. For Korolev, the moon landing had never been the destination. It was merely the beginning. Within months, he proposed the next phase: a permanent lunar base. Not a visit, a settlement. Construction began in the early 1970s. Modules landed autonomously on the lunar surface and waited for human crews. Additional missions expanded the site year after year. By 1974, cosmonauts were spending month-long rotations on the moon. They conducted scientific experiments, grew plants in reduced gravity, and explored the lunar landscape in ways Apollo never could. The science was extraordinary. But the Soviet leadership cared most about the symbolism. Photographs of Soviet citizens living on another world became powerful demonstrations of national prestige. Korolev worked relentlessly through declining health. He rarely slept. His dream was becoming reality. On October 4th, 1979, exactly 22 years after Sputnik, the Soviet government announced that Zvezda base was fully operational. 4 cosmonauts were living on the moon at that very moment. 3 habitat modules, laboratories, solar power systems, and communication networks stretched across the lunar surface. It was the greatest engineering achievement in human history. Even American newspapers placed it on their front pages. Meanwhile, the first space shuttle launched in 1981. It was beautiful. It was revolutionary. But it remained in low Earth orbit. The psychological gap between the two programs was impossible to ignore. Years earlier, Korolev had already begun designing missions to Mars. his notebooks filled with trajectory calculations and mission plans. Though he would not live to see the journey, he knew the path had been laid. Sergei Korolev died in 1980 at the age of 73. He had lived long enough to see humanity walking on the moon and living there permanently. He died knowing he had won. In our world, he died wondering whether the rocket would ever fly. That difference changed everything. The Cold War evolved differently. The Soviet Union negotiated from a position of unprecedented confidence. Détente still occurred, but the balance of prestige had shifted dramatically. Then came 1991. In our world, that year is remembered for the collapse of the Soviet Union. In this world, it is remembered for something else. 3 Soviet cosmonauts landed on Mars. 2 Russians and 1 Ukrainian stepped onto the Red Planet. The greatest journey in human history overshadowed every political crisis on Earth. The crew spent 60 days exploring Mars. They planted a Soviet flag in Martian soil. One photograph, showing Earth and the Moon as tiny, distant points of light, became the most reproduced image ever taken. The achievement delayed the Soviet collapse. National pride temporarily outweighed the forces pulling the Union apart. Economic weaknesses still existed. The planned economy still struggled. Eventually, reform became unavoidable. But the transition was slower and less chaotic than in our world. America adapted differently. Unable to dominate the space race, it focused increasingly on technology, finance, computing, and biotechnology. Economic competition replaced prestige competition. Innovation flourished in new directions. The technological landscape diverged. The Soviet navigation system became the world's standard. Space-driven demand accelerated advances in electronics. 2 competing internets emerged before eventually merging into a shared global network. The result was both more resilient and more heavily monitored. Yet the contradictions of Soviet society never disappeared. Citizens could live on the moon while waiting in line for bread. Prestige could not solve fundamental economic problems. By the late 1990s, Russia and China joined forces to sustain the enormous cost of lunar expansion. Their partnership became the largest scientific collaboration in human history. By 2010, 12 people lived permanently on the moon. Scientists studied geology, astronomy, biology, and advanced materials. America continued planning its return. In 2019, a permanent Mars colony was established. Its residents named it Korolev Station. The man whose survival had changed history now had an entire settlement named in his honor. In 2021, American astronauts finally returned to the moon. They landed near Zvezda Base. A Russian station commander drove out in a rover to greet them. He brought tea. The meeting became one of the most watched events in human history. By 2026, 11 people lived permanently on the moon and 32 on Mars. America maintained a small lunar outpost. Russia and China maintained a thriving extraterrestrial infrastructure. The Cold War was gone. The space race never ended. Would this world be better? Not necessarily. Would it be worse? Not entirely. It would simply be different. Some technologies would emerge elsewhere. Some freedoms might be more limited. Some scientific achievements would arrive decades earlier. Humanity would reach farther into space while carrying many of the same political and economic problems. And every difference would trace back to a single moment. A hospital room in Moscow, January 14th, 1966. A surgeon's hands, a beating heart, a man who survived. History is not shaped only by wars, elections, and revolutions. Sometimes it is shaped by a single life, continuing when it otherwise would have ended. One surgery, one life, one pivotal path.